Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 140. Untitled Kislev, the Rebbe calls this month Chassidus month, being that it's filled with Chassidic holidays, starting, of course, in order of the month, and not necessarily in order of historical events. Resignation, Kislev, the day the Rebbe chose to go home after the miraculous recovery 5 weeks earlier from the serious heart attack, Shmini Atzeres night. Then followed by don't stop anything. Let me enter verification. We apologize for that. We're going to be cutting out this part, and I shall begin again. It's one of these technical glitches. Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 140. Untitled Kislev, the month that the Rebbe calls Chassidus month, being that it's filled with Chassidus Yom Tevim. Beginning from, of course, the first day of the month, Resignation Kislev, in order of the days of the month, not in order of historical events. The day the Rebbe chose to go home after 5 weeks of recuperating from the very serious heart attack that he suffered, the Rebbe, in Shmini Atzeres night, Tov Shelamed Ches. We're going now into the 40th year of those events. Then, of course, there is other days in the month, including Gimel Kislev is the birthday of the Rebbe's brother, Beryl. Hey Kislev is the Chasana of the Tzemach Tzedek. Yudalad Kislev, the Chasana. Tes and Yud Kislev. Tes Kislev is the birthday and yahrzeit of the Mittler Rebbe. Yud Kislev, the Chag HaGeula of the Mittler Rebbe. Yudal Kislev, the Rebbe's wedding, the Rebbe and the Rebbetzins wedding, and Tes Kislev, the yahrzeit of the Maggid of Mezritch, as well as Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus, Tes Kislev. Then, of course, comes Chanukah, which is also Chassidus Yontiv, light, spreading of light, and all that entails. So, in that context, can't talk about all these days. We'll talk about them as the month progresses. But I do want to mention, starting with Resignation Kislev, that there's a fascinating answer that the Rebbe gave to Rabbi Avram Hecht, where he said to look in the Zohar, the Hakdama of Zohar, Daf Daled Amud Beis, where he talks about Rab Chia, Mashiach had said his time has come, and Rabbi asked that he should be given more time. So it's a very fascinating Zohar, and even more fascinating when you look into the details. So I gave a talk about this, which you can find online if you just look for Rabbi Jacobson and Resignation Kislev. It's on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, a talk on this matter. So we won't talk about that because we're after Resignation already. But I will talk about, we're in Parshas Vayetzei, and we're going to the next Yom Tevim, would be Tes and Yud Kislev. So as you may know, Tes and Yud Kislev was the day both of the birthday and the yahrzeit. and the Istalkus of the Mittler Rebbe. And Yud Kislev was the Geula. But interestingly, the year of the Geula came right after the Yortzeit. The first year, rather, I should say, the Mittler Rebbe was freed from prison, and the next year, Yud Kislev was Tovkuf Peches, was the year of the Istalkus. So he just passed away. So obviously, it was a muted celebration the day after the Istalkus of the Mittler Rebbe. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't a great simcha. And the Rebbe explains in a number of places that it has a different type of role than Tes Kislev. The Gzeira, the Kitrug, the challenge of Tes Kislev was on the Gili, the revelation of Chassidus. And the challenge of Yud Kislev was on what the meaning and the significance of a Rebbe is. So we have these 2 days that come this year, it's Friday and Shabbos. So essentially 3 special days connected to the Mittler Rebbe, birthday, Yortzeit, and the Geula. The Rebbe in the Sikha, in the talk he delivered, Parsha Vayetzei, Tovshim Memches, actually explains the connection of Vayetzei to the Mittler Rebbe, because Vayetzei Yankov me Be'er Sheva, this week's Parsha, talks about Yankov leaving Be'er Sheva, Vayelech Charana. And he went towards Charan. Charan is, of course, means literally wrath. Charein Avshal Mokim. And it refers to going from Be'er Sheva to go to the place of Charan, which was like a Yerida, a descent. And the Eira Chaim HaKadosh brought in Chassidus, cited in Chassidus, explains that this is the Yeridus, it refers to the Yeridus on Hashem Beguv, the soul descending into the body of each one of us. So in a sense, Yaakov is each one of us leaving Be'er Sheva, which means the fountain of 7, the 7 midas of Zoh, of Atzilus, 7 midas from Chesed through Malchus, 7, Be'er Sheva, fountain of 7, which is of course in this case Eretz Yisrael, but here it means the higher supernal levels, where the Shama resides, Tachas Kisei HaKavod, under the crown of glory of the divine. Going where? Vayelech Charana, and the Neshama goes down. It goes toward Charana, a hostile world, a difficult world, a world of wrath, a concealed world. And Dafka there, specifically there, and with even the fears that Yaakov Avinu had, which is the fears we all have when we enter a hostile environment, we're given the blessing of Faratzta Yom V'Kednu V'Tzafenu V'Negba, that you will spread and build a family, and I will watch over you, God promises him in the beginning of the Parsha as he dreams by the Malachim and he articulates his fears, and Hashem promises him, you will build a family. Not only you build a family, but it will spread to east and west and north and south, as indeed happens. That 20 years that he spends, even though it was difficult years, very difficult years, with Lavan, the deceitful Lavan, and the mischievous Lavan, and the criminal Lavan, yet Yaakov comes out from there stronger than ever, 20 years later, ready to return, which is the end of this week's chapter. So the general descent of the soul down below, on one hand it's a descent, but it's Yerid Tzedek in order to achieve a greater ascent. The Rebbe explains what is the connection to the Mittler Rebbe. Always comes out either close to Vayetzei, or in this case actually Parsha Vayetzei, because the Mittler Rebbe, even though all the Rabbeim, they're etzem, on the core level they're all one, but the so-called their Parshas and their Giluyim and their revelation, each Rebbe had his particular contribution, and we say, it says in the Sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe cites from the previous Rabbeim, that the Alter Rebbe, well, let's start with the beginning, that Baal Shem Tov and the Magid is Keser. They correspond to Keser, Atik, and Arich. The Alter Rebbe is Chochmeh. The Mittler Rebbe is Bina. Tzemach Tzedek is Das. And it goes down all the way to Malchus, which would be our Rebbe, the Deir HaShvi. So Chochmeh and Bina, Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, and you see it in a very apparent way in their writings, in their teachings. The Alter Rebbe spoke even after Peterburg, even after he was released from Tes Kislev. After the prison, he was released in Tes Kislev, where he began to elaborate more. Still, his elaboration, the Alter Rebbe, is still Chochmeh compared to the Recheves Hanar of Bina. Recheves Hanar, the wide, expansive rivers. So Chochmeh is like the Mayon. It's a spring of water. There, it's connected to the source, but it comes out drop by drop by drop, like Chochmeh. Sparks, concentrated kernels of ideas on the conception level, which then comes to the comprehension level, that spread out and become what we call a Recheves Hanar, meaning the wide expanses, the wide banks of a river. And a river is exactly that. When you look into the Chassidus of the Mittler Rebbe, you'll see one page of the Alter Rebbe could be 30 pages by the Mittler Rebbe. Not necessarily exactly that number, but in that range. And the Mittler Rebbe's role was to take the kernels and take these sparks and turn them into long and elaborate discussions where you go through and break down the details and flesh it out. So that is an element of Yitziyah, Vayetzei. Because Vayetzei, Yaakov Ber Sheva, starts with Sheva and Neshama Beguf in a general sense. But on an intellectual sense, Chochmah is the core, and Vayetzei is bringing it outward, which is the idea of Bina, where Bina takes the idea and brings it outward that we should understand it, and then we can internalize it. So though on one hand, Chochmah, we say, senses the truth, like he says in Perek Lamed Hey, chapter 35 in the Chagah, in Tanya, that the Alter Rebbe says he heard Memede from the Maggid, that Hu Levade ve'en Zolase is, you can hear in Chochmah. Chochmah senses that you and nothing else. On the other hand, Bina develops it into an entire comprehensive understanding that makes it palatable and capable for us to internalize. So Chochmah, so-called, keeps it connected to the source, and Bina develops it into a full-blown idea and concept. And of course, you need both Chochmah and Bina; they come together, Chochmah and Bina. And the Mittler Rebbe is that Bina. So in that sense of the word, it's a form of Vayetzei, leaving, with the purpose, obviously, of not leaving, God forbid, the source, but bringing it to the expanses of the world that it can be comprehended and understood. In different Sfarim, maybe Ramach Esis or other places, it says that Chochmah Hetzach the Inyan, and Bina is Hetzach as Ich versteh. So in Chochmah you hear the idea, and in Bina you hear that I understand, which on one hand there's an I, a yesh, but on the other hand it's internalized that fashion. We would hear from our mashpia, Rab Meir Tzvivel, who passed away 2 weeks ago, a little less than 2 weeks ago, that the Chochmah is the Zach nem der Mensch. Und Bina is the Mensch nem der Zach. So Chochmah, the idea, grasps and encompasses and consumes the person. And in Bina, the person consumes the idea. So each has a quality that the other does not have. When the neshama is above, in Be'er Sheva, there it's in its own confines, its own comfort zone. So on one hand, it's beautiful. It's basking in spiritual delight. But what it doesn't have is the deeper dimensions that are revealed specifically when it comes into the dire straits and the narrow straits of Charon, Vayelech Charona. That's where you build a family. So Chochmah, for all its power, if it doesn't come into Bina, you don't have a structure. That's why Bina is also connected to Chochmah, to Isha. Bina Yisrael Nitna Be'isha, because they build a home. Taka says Chochmas Nashim Bon Sebesa, the word Chochmas, but Bina is of course a component in that, because that develops and brings it out into a full-blown and a full developed concept that can be worked with. So we have that, and the lesson to us in our lives is that the Rabbeim represent the flow and represent the progression of how Seder Shtalshlus works, how the cosmic order works, and also how we work, which is, as much as we're connected to the source, we are then charged with Vayetzei to leave that source and bring its integrity, while maintaining its integrity, bring its message to the outer dimensions. And that's the real Chiddush. If a person can explain something and remain true to the source, that's the ultimate achievement. Chassidus brings the expression that Bina, without Chochmah, you can go derech haklosen, you can go off, which is a simple practical advice that when you're in the middle of, let's say, writing something or developing an idea, always make sure, as a reality check, to stay honest, go back to the initial point. So when you start something, always write down one line. This is my initial point of departure, my Chochmah. And then when you let it flow into details, connect those details, and that way you'll have the advantage of both. Many times we get off on all kinds of details and we forget our point of departure, why we began in the first place. So it's also a simple practical lesson in life, but especially in Avodas Hashem and serving God, is that idea that even when you're going and doing different type of things and bringing your futzma nesecha chutza, spreading it, the mayin nesecha chochma, but you always make sure you're in touch with the sources, which is why I bend over backwards and try and work, especially focusing on making sure everything that is said here is with sources, because especially today, after Gimel Tammuz, with different opinions and so on, staying true to the source is a guaranteed way of that you're standing on an eisen brick on an iron bridge, which holds us up. So even when you go and explain things to the forest outskirts, chutza, you always have that connection that makes sure that you're sticking to the original and so on. And as a matter of fact, the deeper you understand that original, the deeper you go into Chochmah, the more it allows you to bring it to Bina and further outward. So that's a lesson in life in general. That my students make me the wisest, because when you bring something out, then you have to dig deeper to able to reach outward. You need to dig deeper into the source. Okay, now let's go to some questions. We'll start with the question: do we need to be politically correct and avoid controversial issues? So let's read the question. Well, the question is self-understood. It means, I guess, a chassid is meant to be non-political partisan. Is meant to be non-political and non-partisan. How then should we react when we hear something wrong on many levels, even though it may be a political issue? Are we expected to ignore it, or should we confront it even if it's a hot potato and politically incorrect? In general, being surrounded by a world full of differing opinions, some innocent and some warped, how is one expected to disagree like a mentch? What do you do when you're dealing with someone who's simply being exasperatingly inflexible? Yeah, we all know the feeling. Okay, so this is really a two-part question. Let's first discuss about politically correctness and incorrectness and so on. You know, anyone working with people knows that there are topics that are easier to talk about and others that are harder to talk about because they're simply, as you put it, a hot potato. They are, no matter what you say, you can't win because they're emotionally charged. Either it's very distorted or people just are simply not able to hear. So the question is how to address it. Really, it's a communication question. Because let's make one thing clear. We were not charged to so-called be politically correct and therefore conceal or distort, for that matter, what the truth is. At the same time, as the Rebbe says in a number of places, when to say the truth and how to say the truth is also a critical component. I've mentioned this a number of times, where in the Mishnah it says, Da Masha Toshiv. You should know what to answer to an apikaris, to a person who is a heretic, so on. And then it says in the Pasuk in Mishlei, it says, Al Tan La'ovel Bavlose. You shouldn't go ahead and answer a fool or a challenger in his foolishness. So which one is it, to answer or not to answer? So listen to what the Mishnah says. It doesn't say Toshiv. It says Da Masha Toshiv. Know what to answer. So we must be armed and informed and knowledgeable in any given issue. Obviously, you can't be expected to know everything. That's why we have mashpiim. We'll talk about that later. We have mentors. We have teachers. But in general, the more armed you are with knowledge, the more you're equipped to be able to address issues and so on. But that says da. It doesn't mean you have to answer all the time. There are many times that by answering, you actually instigate and incite, and it creates more problems than it solves. So this is not about being apologetic, and I don't want to speak about it because it's an uncomfortable topic. It's about who you're speaking to and what is the benefit of speaking. You find sometimes people who may be on the side of truth and might be saying the right thing, but they get into a little natzchonis. Natzchonis means a certain type of pulling rank or feeling I know better than you, and almost, I don't say condescending, but in some way speaking down to the other person. So you may be saying the right things, but you're saying it the wrong way. Because what's the benefit? How will it help that person that you prove that you're right? Which is why debates and proving one is right or wrong is not the issue here. Think of parents and children. It's not about being right. It's about saying it in a way that the person can receive and hear it. So let's make it clear. People who are difficulty just and want to be wishy-washy and don't have any standards or values and so on, I'm not discussing that. That's a person who has other issues. The issues are they're uncomfortable or they're apologetic or they are not, or they feel defensive about particular issues. We're talking about someone who knows what the issue is and has what to say. Should one have to get up and ruffle feathers and disturb the peace? So this is a case by case. I've obviously deal with this literally on a daily basis. And there are times I will intentionally actually say something, not because I got emotional or because someone provoked, but because I want to in some way challenge and be provocative. But you have to be very careful because sometimes doing that you could also end up defeating the purpose. We all know the story. I've told it a number of times. Velvel Green, who Rabbi Feller in Minnesota was bringing closer to Yiddishkeit, he had big questions as a scientist about the age of the universe, about evolution. So Rabbi Feller gave him the letters that the Rebbe wrote about it. And he looked at the letters, he said, it's not for an academic like me, that's for beginners. So Rabbi Feller encouraged him, write to the Rebbe. We're talking about the early 60s. So he wrote to the Rebbe a blunt letter saying, I read your letters and that's sufficient. The Rebbe did not respond. So of course time passed And he was convinced the Rebbe didn't have what to say. A few years later, I don't know the exact timeline, he was by the Rebbe in Yechidus, and by that point he became a Shem Shabbos and was getting involved in Yiddishkeit in many ways. And he had a long Yechidus with the Rebbe. At the end of the Yechidus, the private audience, the Rebbe says to him, in regard to the questions you asked me back then, I'd like to respond now. And he began to respond in a very impressive way. The Rebbe Velvel Green was extremely taken. And he said to the Rebbe, it's a brilliant answer you've given me. But why didn't you answer this a few years ago when I asked the question? So the Rebbe said, and I thought that you didn't have an answer, that's why you just avoided it. And the Rebbe said, because I sensed from your writing that I may have won an argument, but I would have lost a chassid. Now, what does this mean? It means timing is everything. You have to know when to say it, how to say it. Sometimes a person in their arrogance or in their locked, inflexible position are unable to hear something. A little while passes, they can hear it. So it's not about zdah mashatoshiv. But the key here is, it's not about politically correct or politically incorrect, it's how to say it and what form to say it. There are many issues that are really difficult to talk about. If you find an issue that you feel getting into hot water, I would suggest don't talk about it. Find a way, a nice diplomatic and nice way to get around it. Because you can cause more damage by talking about something, even if you're knowledgeable and you have what to say, if it's not said correctly. And this is not about whether you're going to alienate people. It's not the point of alienation. The point is influencing them, impressing upon them. And that requires a special art of knowing how to say a truth, especially one that's uncomfortable or politically incorrect. Now, here's not the place to go into specific examples because that question was a general one. Now, this leads me to the second half of the question, which is how to disagree like a mentch, civilly. Well, I mean, let's put it this way. If you're a civil human being, then usually disagreements are also civil. If you're not a civil human being, obviously disagreements is a perfect platform and breeding ground for arguments. So if you're an argumentative person, rest assured a disagreement is going to just bring out more arguments. It goes back to the same idea. You're just here to win. You want to just prove you're smart, you're better. This can destroy marriages, it can destroy relationships, it destroys friendships. So the most important thing is to know you know something well. You don't have to win every time. You have to be a mentch, which means you have to think in terms of humility. Unfortunately, and we'll state it outright, arrogance is often how people hide their ignorance with their arrogance. Or arrogance is sometimes the key here, that it says you have to be wrong for me to be right. I have to win. People who have to win usually are not that secure. You'll see very secure people in their ideas. They're fine. The Rebbe did not have to prove anything to Velvel Green. You think he didn't know that he may think that the Rebbe doesn't have an answer? Everything in its time. So the same thing is here. Arguing not like a mentch is a problem in general about general menschlichkeit and behavior. Divrei chachamim benachas nishma. The words of the wise go benachas. Nachas means gentle, subtle, not confrontational, and so on. Are there times to argue a point whether you get passion? Yes, as long as it's not destroying the whole spirit of the conversation or the communication. You have many arguments. But this is the critical thing, is to be a bitteldika person. If you really know what you're saying and you really feel confident, there's ways to say it that are very gentle, that don't have to be like the hammer on the other person's head. You see someone says something wrong, you don't necessarily have to humiliate them or say something that is insulting. You could say it in a kind way, and we've all been guilty, including myself, of sometimes in the throes of passion or in the moment you get excited and you say sometimes something that maybe shouldn't have been said. Fine. That's how we correct ourselves, and we step back and say to yourself, okay, you know what? I may have said something that's right, but I may have said it in a way that wasn't the right way. There's ways to correct that as well. So it's about really communication is about how to package and how to present things. Unfortunately, we see people disagreeing to the point they become enemies. God forbid. Despise each other. Don't talk to each other. This is a sign where egos and personalities have become more important than the truth, which can happen. But that's why we're here, to try to be honest. The Torah asks us, Chassidus asks us to be honest and to be looking for the truth, not so much that I am right, but for the truth. And I can't resist the statement that I always like very much. I don't know who's coined it. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Because that's truth. When you care, then people sense that. If they hear you know a lot, but they don't feel you care, think about how your words will have an effect. Or in the words that the Rebbe cites so often from Rabbeinu Tam, Dvarim hayetzim min halev, nichnasim al halev, upoilim pulasam. Words that come from the heart enter the heart and affect the person. Words that come out of the mouth or the brain go into one ear and usually out the other. The question is how long it takes for it to get out. But from the heart enters the heart. And the truth from the heart is deeper than any intellectual truth. This doesn't mean sincerity is anything. Obviously, you also have to know your facts and know your information. But sincerity and caring plus information trumps all the information in the world. Okay. So we took with that politically correct. And how do we disagree like a mentch? Next question, which maybe I should have began with because it's so much connected to Chassidus month, which is the month, the issue of mashpiim. So, we are now beginning, Tes Kislev will be 40 years. And 40 years, we begin to appreciate the depth of what we were told. 40 years ago, Tes Kislev, the Rebbe initiated the concept of mashpiim. We will talk about that more later in this month, but it's a topic that I think is one of the unfulfilled marching orders that we received that we have not fully done. Shabbos Chazain Dvorim Tov Shem Vov, the Rebbe initiated Aseh L'cha Rav, which some say is a form of mashpia. You could say it's a little different. What's a Rav, a Chaver, a Yoyetz, a Shefet, and a mashpia? There are probably subtle differences, but regardless, it's all about having someone that you can speak to, a mentor that's objective, that helps you see things clearly, make decisions that are sometimes complicated, or because of our blind spots and subjectivity, we can't fully always address on our own. So Tes Kislev, in a fascinating way, that Rebbe in detail described the need to appoint mashpiim, and made it clear that mashpiim does not mean one person over hundreds. It could be one mashpia. One person has one mashpia, and that mashpia has one person that he has influence on. And the Rebbe spoke about women also doing the same thing. So in the sichos of Tes Kislev, and the continuing sichos of Rosh Chodesh Shvat, Yud Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, and Shabbos Parsha V'Yaakov Pekudei, the Rebbe continued this theme, and I would encourage everyone to make it a priority to read these sichos that are all published today. Some of them are even recorded, so you could hear them. So in that context, we're going to be talking about mashpiim a bit because of this 40th anniversary. So though I discussed mashpiim back in episodes 20, 74, and 98, so here's an opportunity to tell you that this is episode 140. But the 139 previous episodes are all accessible. They're all time-stamped, for that matter, which means you don't have to listen to the entire hour or hour and 15 minutes. But you can actually find the topic and just listen to that section by pressing there on YouTube the timestamp, which is the time where that topic is discussed in each episode. And you can also search Google or our site, meaningfullife.com, and find the topics. Obviously, in 140 episodes, we've addressed hundreds and hundreds of topics. And it's a real library and a wealthy library of resource that addresses issues. So we talked about mashpiim in episodes 20, 74, and 98. If you go to meaningfullife.com/MyLife, you'll see a landing page that includes their archives of previous programs, which can also be downloaded, MP3s. You can listen to it in a car, or if you're running or anything. It doesn't have to be in a stationary place where you're sitting at a computer. It's all mobile today, as they say. So in that context, in addition to what I spoke about in those episodes, I want to talk about, here's the question, in the current climate of I know what's best for me and no one can tell me how to live my life, some of us have lost appreciation for the value of mashpiim. Why did the Rebbe introduce the concept of a mashpia as a bakosha nafshis, which means a heartfelt request? What makes it so critical in our lives, to our lives? When one does resolve to have a mashpia, what qualities should he or she be looking for? Can anyone be a mashpia? Okay, so, and another questioner, let me read another question on this topic, and that is, Rabbi Jacobson, I'm attempting to work on writing something about the need for mashpiim and to encourage people to step up to the plate. Where are the mashpiim? My thoughts are that everyone are the mashpiim. What are the qualities the Rebbe said to look for in a mashpia? Where did the Rebbe speak about the idea that a mashpia doesn't need to be perfect? Who determines who's qualified? Did the Rebbe speak about this? What if someone doesn't think he's the mashpia type, but people respect him? Would he qualify just on account that people look up to him? So I referred you to the sichos in Tov Shin Lamed Zayin 40 years ago. As I said, Tes Kislev, well, it's actually Chav Kislev. I said, also Chav Ches Adar that year. and Shabbos Pasha V'Yakov Pekudei. Fine. Now, some of this I talked about then, but I want to just say a few things. But let's start with the Bakosha Nafshis. It's hard to read into the Rebbe's reasons for things unless you have a clear indicator that the Rebbe said this is the reason, but it's pretty obvious that the importance of a mashpia, and especially in our day and age. Because the bottom line is, an Adam Kodev Eitz Latzmei. We're all subjective. And we minimize things when it comes to ourselves, even though we maximize it when it comes to someone else. So the first thing is simply to be an honest person, to be a person of integrity, to look at something, and especially if it's something that is shrouded in controversy or complex. Having a mashpia is a sounding board. You're simply asking someone that you can trust, that you can run by, and they may not even be smarter than you, but they're more objective than you. And that allows them to give you insight and shed light on something that you yourself may have a blind spot or not be able to address. Of course, this goes across the board. This could be physical decisions and material decisions. It could be spiritual decisions. It could be things about work. It could be a person's own avodah, the idea of being accountable to another. The criteria for a mashpia, Yud Shvat Tovshin Lamed Zayin, as I said 40 years ago, the Rebbe actually used the expression where it says in Chassidus all the difference between Eir and Shefa. What's the root for the word mashpia? Shefa. So Eir is, Chassidus talks about as Me'ena Moyer, it's attached to its source, it reflects its source. Shefa, on the contrary, is something that applies itself to the recipient. Eir only focuses on itself and reflects myself, and I say not in an arrogant way, reflects on revealing what the source wants. Shefa looks at what your needs are and applies it, and applies itself, and internalizes it. You can say in a certain way, Chachma is more like and Bina is like Shefa. In some places it says something similar to that. But the point I want to make here is that Shefa is a mashpia that's not just reflecting what the Torah says. That's a Rav. A Rav comes, you show only Mashayla. A mashpia is someone that's mashpia Shefa, a flow, a communication, and addresses your needs. And there in Yud Shvat, in a fascinating way, the Rebbe speaks about all the criteria. I'll sum it up when we get closer to them, but you can look it up. So we have the criteria. Now, as far as anyone being mashpia, Tes Kislev, it's very clear. The Rebbe says there's no criteria. All you have to do, the Rebbe says, is volunteer. And you see somebody that may need some help, volunteer. And we'll see if it works out. It's not a lifetime contract. It's not guaranteed. You see, if you end up being someone that person responds to, you've succeeded. So mashpiim is not any collective or global thing, and you have to go through a whole series of shevach kidus and bedikas to figure out whether you could. You see you're in a situation, make yourself available. Not out of arrogance, but maybe you can shed some light. I shared this, by the way, this sikha months ago when one of those episodes. An interesting thing happened. A woman called me from the community and said that she's a landlord and she keeps hearing arguments between her tenant, the husband and wife, don't stop arguing. She tries to block it out, but she can't, it's so loud. So she just ignored it. But then she heard what I was saying, so she decided she was waiting one day. She waited for the woman to walk out of the house. And she went over and said, with all the apologies and sensitively, I hope I'm not stepping over any boundaries. If I am, please forgive me, and I'll never bring this up again. But I hear your arguments you have with your husband, and I just wanted to tell you, you have a sympathetic ear in me. If you'd like to talk, I'm happy to speak to you. And again, I apologize if I crossed any lines. And the woman began to cry and couldn't stop thanking her. Someone finally cares. She says, nobody cares. And they started talking, and it helped to save the marriage. How do you like that? All hirah from the Rebbe. So mashpia doesn't have to be a dramatic thing with glitz and fanfare and all that. It's simply showing you care. And every one of us has people that are in our sphere of influence, or people we know, and other people. Hashgacha pratis. You're there. Now, obviously, this is not about imposing yourself or pushing yourself. All with sensitivity, you have to be sensitive. In this case, the woman could have told her, no, I don't want to hear anything from you. Maybe she wasn't ready. But this landlord did the right thing because she approached her with that type of kindness. So with all this, basically, mashpia, there's no real rules. It's about caring, trying to fulfill the Rebbe's Zerah, and really trying to be a Chassidic person who's there for another. And it's not about one person who's like better and smarter than everybody else. So yes, it could be someone that you respect, that you can open up to, that you feel also confidential, and you can trust. You want to speak to someone you can trust. Without that, obviously, it won't work well. So that's a general answer to your questions. Let me see. Bakosha Nafshis I mentioned. I'm especially later in Tavshim and Vav, it was clear that with the mashpia, many of our problems we have today would not be there, because we make mistakes based on our own subjective things. So my sense is that the Rebbe's Bakosha Nafshis was also because he felt this was a way of really fulfilling the Rebbe's kavanah and the Chassidus kavanah of Chassidus in this world, and somewhat neutralizing the subjective and self-interest element that can bias and prejudice us. Okay, I think that's sufficient for now. We will talk more about it, as I said, but that will suffice. Okay. Next question. How is the modern day religious violence setting the stage for Mashiach? So we're talking now a question that I'll read in detail now. The Rambam writes that the major religions helped pave the way and spread the concept of Mashiach. How can we make sense of this statement in light of the havoc and destruction being wreaked in the world today by radical Islam? Is the Rambam perhaps referring to a different time period? How practically will other religions aid in setting the stage for Mashiach? Another question-related issue, related topic. Dear Rabbi, you are an amazing gift to all humankind, or to humankind, I should say. Thank you. You mentioned once that the Rambam wrote that the two big religions will help bring the world a step closer to Messianic times. Can you please explain this further, and can you please cite the exact source? The exact source is the end of chapter 11 of Hilchos Melachim U'Molcham at the end of Mishnah Torah, the book of Halacha from the Rambam. Now, when you look in the Rambam, most Rambams you look at, you'll not find this statement, because it was taken out by the censors due to the fact that the Rambam speaks there explicitly both about Christianity and about Islam and about their so-called prophets. But ironically, in the Tfus Remi, the Roman edition of the Rambam, you have the full text, and now it's been republished. You can see in Rambam La'am and other places the full text. And there's a line there. After he negates the other religions as far as their claims they made, he says that God in his mysterious ways did allow these religions to proliferate, and they've reached billions of people. You know, we have today 2.5 billion, we have 2 billion Christians, and we have 1.8 billion Muslims. It's half the world. And so therefore you have to say there's some positive side to it, and that is that they help pave the way to spread the message of Mashiach, spread the message of divine unity. So it's pretty radical words that Rambam says, but he says it, and the Rebbe cites it a number of times, and that's the source. The explanation for it and the question, how do we explain it? Well, let's look at history. It is true that for many years, Christians wreaked havoc in this world as well, maybe even more than the Muslims today. The Crusaders, the Inquisitions, the different radical forces that Jews, of course, suffered the brunt of it more than anybody. So they terrorized the world. But let's look at where we are today. Today, Christianity is the founders of this country, United States of America, and many countries that are docile, not just docile, but they are Malchus Shel Chesed, kind and benevolent countries, became a haven for Jews and for all people. Freedom of religion, freedom of expression. And we don't have to be concerned coming from that faith. Now, it wasn't necessarily based on a religious message, but it's coming from people who embrace those teachings. So at the end of the day, the Torah teachings have ultimately actually helped those nations and those religions to become more sensitive. And therefore, founding fathers established a country that allows for these freedoms and allows for the freedoms that we can celebrate and benefit from today. So you see it with our own eyes. The fact that Islam has not reached there, you can say Islam, remember, began 6 centuries after Christianity and is going through its growing pains, and unfortunately is still in a state where Christianity may have been a few hundred years ago. But they too will come to this conclusion, which explains the Zohar that says, why did God, and Chassidus brings it out, that some Tzaddik in Eratei Bracha brings, why did God ask Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav if they wanted the Torah by Sinai? He of course knew they were going to reject it, and they did reject it. And what would have happened if they said yes? And the answer is because through that he helped warm them up to one day embrace these teachings. Sheva Mrs. Bnei Neach and other principles of the divine, of God and love and L'Sheves Yitzhara, to build a civilized world of Tzedek and Yesher, of Chesed, of kindness, virtue, justice, and so on. So we have to say that even though right now we don't see it yet in the Muslim world, it will come to be, and not in hundreds of years. That ultimately they will fulfill what the Rambam says, and the Rambam, obviously based on this Torah that I mentioned, the Zohar and so on, it becomes much more apparent that there is a pattern. So when we're living a few thousand years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or a few hundred years ago, you didn't see it emerging. Now you see it emerging. You see a world becoming more humanitarian, more charitable, more kind. There's more work to be done. But the world is the path is being paved toward Mashiach values. You can see it in many different ways, and this is the sichos of the Rebbe, to open our eyes, to see the patterns, to connect the dots, and see these things emerging that are leading to the world where it'll be loy kina v'loy sachrus, loy ra v'loy milchama, a world without jealousy, without avarice, without war, without hunger. And we see that happening with our own very eyes. So though we still have work to be done, but the approach is going in that direction as the world becomes better and more improved, that you can't even compare the world today to the way it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and hundreds of years ago. Okay. And what can we do about it? Well, as the Rebbe says in a number of sichos in the mems, we can do is wherever we go, just like with Jews, we speak about Yiddishkeit, to talk about God and about God's moral principles that each of us has to embrace, that is etched on our currency in America. In God we trust, e pluribus unum, and the principles of charity, of kindness, of the Rebbe's words to CNN, to increase in acts of goodness and kindness. Tzedek and Yesher, which goes back to what Avram Avinu gave to all his children, including Yishmael, including Esav, his grandson, son of Isaac. And the Torah, as the Rambam paskins at the end of chapter 8 of Hilchos Malachim, that we're responsible, Jews are, to spread this message also to non-Jews, and that it came from Sinai. It came from Sinai. And as God, by Sinai, actually asked both Bnei Seir and Bnei Seir and Bnei Yishmael to Harparan and Seir, to accept and embrace this Torah, which they ultimately will do and are in the process of doing as we speak. Okay. Next question, dreams. Should we take dreams seriously? In this week's Parsha, Yaakov Avinu dreams his famous dream of the angels and the ladder. There's no doubt of the significance of this dream, but is this the case with all dreams? Should we read into any dream we have? Is it our subconscious telling us things we should pay attention to? Or should dreams just be disregarded and left to the breeze? I refer you as well to episode 62, where I discussed this topic, should we interpret dreams? So this is a complementary discussion, complementing the ideas in that episode. So we have, firstly, directives from the Rebbe, but it goes back to the Chazal itself. On one hand, the Gemara tells us, Ein cholam b'lo dvarim b'telem. There's no dream without nonsense. On the other hand, we say a dream can be a mini prophecy. The problem is it's all snowballed into one, and you don't know which is which is the reason that the Rebbe writes in so many letters to people who talk about bad dreams or strange dreams or disconcerting dreams and so on, to ignore a dream. Especially the Gemara says that of Shemer Sadavar, in Parsha Vayetzei, when Yosef is speaking about his dreams, the Gemara says that Hakol Helech Achar HaPisin, that a dream follows its interpretation. So sometimes best not to interpret things. When a dream repeats itself, like it was with Pari, or other things that seem to cause a person to be more serious, we have halachas about Tainus Cholam, where a person has a bad dream and feels that they have to fast on Shabbos, and halacha allows for it. But it should be done with a mashpia, with a rav, because we can't just, because it could be just you're paranoid, or overly vulnerable, or overly defensive, or overly whatever, sensitive, and every time you have a dream, it shakes you. You have to build your life. The Rebbe once told somebody who asked for an interpretation of a dream, the Rebbe said, let's first figure out our lives when we're awake before we get to dreams. So generally speaking, the answer is yes, we have to ignore most dreams, maybe all of them, Because that's not, Hashem wants to find a way to get us the message, He'll find a way. Should there be circumstances which are not the ordinary, Vayetzei min haklal, meaning not the common occurrence, not the usual, that you have to talk to someone who knows you, you can review it, and they may tell you, let's look into it further, or they may say, let's ignore it. And ignoring a dream is perfectly fine. So that's a general answer to how we look at dreams. Now the fact that in the Torah there's dreams, this case of this parsha as you mentioned, Yosef dreams later, Pari's dreams and so on, tells you of course that a dream has power. We know that. And in the Zohar and in Gemara, talks on Gemara and Brachas, there's a whole sugya about if you saw this in a dream, anticipate this. You saw that in a dream. But at the end of the day, we also have halach, and we have the Tomim Tiyem Hashem Alekecha path, this straight path that we've been guided and directed by our Rabbeim and our sages, that we do not look to dreams for answers. There are times, and this has happened to people, you go to sleep with a dilemma, even a question in Gemara or a question of Chassidus, and you wake up with an answer. Great. That's not interpreting a dream. It's like you got an answer, a certain clarity. But to look at dreams can be very dangerous because we, above all in Judaism, teach responsibility. And you don't want to start getting into the fact that most people love the exotica and love the sensational. We don't want to go into that place. We want to be able to focus on things that we know for sure, things that come to us in a direct way, a Torah-dik way. Again, if God wants to get us a message, He'll get us this message. So that's the general response and general approach, a very responsible approach, a very practical approach. Okay. Next question. So here we have some follow-up. I think I covered the new questions. Just checking, yeah. Follow-up one to the Kinus Hashluchim. So last week I spoke about the history of when the Rebbe first established and encouraged the Kinus Hashluchim, the Shluchim annual conference. And we received a note from someone who gave us a little filling in more details, writing like this. So, starting from, I believe, somewhere in the Yuds, which would be in the 50s, on Chol HaMoed Sukkos, there was always a major, obviously, then a much smaller scale event than now, a major gathering held under the auspices of Tzach, Lubavitch Youth Organization. Rabbi Chadakov would speak, and Rabbi Moshe Goldman and all Shluchim then would give their reports. That was indeed the precursor of today's Kinus Hashluchim under Merkez. And they'd say, for further details, we should talk to Rabbi Goldman, Rabbi Costel, and others. So that's true. Thank you for this filling that in. So in other words, it's true, it's on a different scale, but the idea of aduch and reporting and coming together and talk about activities does go back all the way in the Yuds, and it was correct during Sukkot. So thank you for that information. No comment. Obviously, it's correct. Another follow-up was about the issue of resignation. Hi, Rabbi Jacobson. Thank you for your wonderful classes every week. This week you were discussing about a person using yush, resignation, as a way to stay in one's life. It's Hashgacha Pratis that you mentioned this, as I was just with my therapist and we were discussing this exact concept, and specifically how I tend to use this pedestal that I made for myself as an excuse for my resignation. We discussed that one way to combat this is to set small goals and really choose to own them. You also mentioned that one of the ways to combat yush, resignation, is to know that these thoughts are coming from the Yetzer Hara and that they are toxic. What positive things does the Rebbe or the Chassidus talk about with regard to combating yush? Again, thank you for this great program. Okay. I thought I spoke about that last week, also with the Rebbe Sukkot, but let me elaborate. There are two ways to fight darkness. One is to just combat it and just to push away things, negative thoughts. Another was to bring light into the picture. Hands down, you look around. If you want to get somebody who's caught up in resigned thoughts or other feelings of resignation or despair and so on, hands down the best way to do it is to find something they're passionate about and excited about. You say, what about their resignation? Well, once they're doing something they're excited and passionate about, a little light will dispel much darkness. A little positive, or even a lot of positive, will dispel the negative automatically. Like he says in Tanya, chapter 12, it's like fire. It's not like fire and water, where enough fire can evaporate large bodies of water, and enough water can extinguish great fires. Cheshach and Eir cheshech is the absence of light. You bring a little light into the darkest room, that area will be illuminated. You may need more light to illuminate the entire room, but there's no battle. That's like a tremendous psychological resource that you don't have to fight. The fight is to you to not allow the resignation to stop you from doing good things. But get yourself involved in something you're excited about, passionate about. Guaranteed resignation will go down. So that's the first, most immediate thing that we do. Now you'll say, well, I can't get out of bed, or I'm resigned, so it's like a catch-22 situation. You're telling me, do something positive, or I'm resigned, I don't feel I want to do something. Well, my friend, we're adults, and at times we have to rise to the occasion and fight our inclinations. No one else is going to do it for you. There's no magic pill to take, the anti-resignation pill. So that's why I say find things b'mokim sheli bechofet, something your heart desires. Obviously something that's like pulling teeth or difficult, there's not going to be very much motivation. Find something you like, something that empowers you, something that makes you feel good about yourself, something that you're helping another person, and guaranteed the resignation will go down. Are there other suggestions? Of course there are. They're all in that same vein, the positive. Now, knowing that resignation is basically an enemy, a voice inside of you, no different than someone trying to just demoralize you, like he says in Tanya about atzvus, obviously helps. But that's not the main focus. Just sitting and thinking all day how it's coming from the negative is not going to make you feel better. It'll just know that's the enemy. What you want to do is bring in a friend, bring in a force that brings the positive into the picture. So that's what I have to say about resignation. And if you have further questions, please write them. Maybe I missed something from what you're writing, but I think I tried to address what you have said. Okay, let's move on to the Chassidus question of the week. Chassidus question is, why is prayer the primary service in our times? In Tanya Kuntras Achrin, which is, as you know, Tanya made up of 5 sections. The first is L'Kutei Amorim, Sha'ar Yuchid V'Amunah, Geras HaTshuva, Geras HaKedesh, and Kuntras Achrin. Tanya, of course, the 52 chapters in the first section of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe wrote as that sefer. The same thing with Sha'ar Yuchid V'Amunah, Geras HaTshuva. Geras HaKedesh is, like the name implies, is letters, and Kuntras Achrin means the last manuscript, so to speak. Additional things they added on, which are the children of the Alter Rebbe when Tanya was printed. So in Kuntras Achrin, which is not numbered, by the way, at least in the Tanya that we have, so it's by names, so I'll just tell you the pages. Page 155a, which is Lahavin mashpia Vayetzei Chaim, to understand what it says in Vayetzei Chaim, which is a sefer of the Arizal written by Chaim Vital, and page 162a, which is the next to last piece in Kuntras Achrin with Alter Rebbe Shmuel. He talks about a Shmuel, a negative rumor that he heard. News that he heard about people rushing in their prayers and rushing the chazan and not letting the chazan to pray barichas. So in both those places, the Alter Rebbe explains from Vayetzei Chaim, and the Rebbe Tzeichen is there, Shar Aleph, Gate 1, Chapter 7, to look there, that prayer tefillah is the primary service in our time. In Ikvus of the Mashiach, it's the primary avodah. In earlier generations, Torah and mitzvahs, Torah especially was, but today when we don't have that much time to learn Torah, one of the things the Alter Rebbe says, so prayer is the primary service, Ikra Aveda. Can you please explain the reason for this in simple words? And if that's the case, why is davening not emphasized that much by many today? Yeah, absolutely. Good. Very good question. Now, let's first describe what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, and then we'll take it from there. First thing, the Alter Rebbe in Lahavin mashpia Vayetzei Chaim says that, asks the question on the Vayetzei Chaim, why is tefillah the primary service in our time? Ikar habirur, here's the words, Ikar habirur ha'idei tefillah dafka. Bizman hazeh, in our time, the main refinement is through davening. When we know that Torah is greater than davening. In many places it talks about the quality of Torah over tefillah. And the Alter Rebbe, in some, to briefly sum it up, says the following. Because Torah is Chachmei law and it gives us instruction of how to live our lives. But it does not change the physical reality of the world. It's mamshech elokus into the world. And tefillah, we have the power to actually draw down rain, to bring healing, and actually physically change Elam Hazeh. In order to do so, We have to be mamshech the kol yochel, the power of the divine Ein Sof, and we do that b'chol ma'edecha through the halos man of an awakening from below. In Torah, you don't need that much awakening from below. You need to learn Torah, so you need to, of course, make that effort. But here you have to plumb the depths of your own heart and soul to pray in order to draw down that power to change reality in this existence. That's what he says in the Kinus Hashluchim. Now, the Kinus Hashluchim, the second one I referred to, which was page 162a, the Alter Rebbe says that he repeats the Pri Eitz Chaim. There he also says Eitz Chaim. We're still looking for words in Eitz Chaim. And there he says that in the Deirish Hashanim, in the early generations, they were able to achieve Kerega, very briefly, through Krishma and the davening that they said. The Lashon exactly is, just to get you, Deirish Hashanim, through Krishma and Psuka de Zimra, Kerega. But today, we have to do it through the more lengthy and work and service in prayer. So that's what it says in the Geras HaKedesh, in Kinus Hashluchim. I'm sorry. Now the Rebbe has a ha'ara, Shiurim b'Sefer HaTanya, which Rabbi Weinberg would teach, Motzei Shabbos Tanya, in order. He merited that the Rebbe, and we all merited that the Rebbe edited these Shiurim, and there's tremendous insights and chidushim and to understand Tanya. The Rebbe has a whole footnote here, which is very worthwhile reading. So I'll read to you what the Rebbe writes. The Rebbe says, it says Bizman Hazeh. So the Alter Rebbe's initial question was not what the power of prayer is over davening, but why Bizman Hazeh? Why now is prayer the primary way to refine? And it doesn't seem to answer that question. The Rebbe's words, because the answer that I just repeated was that tefillah has a power to change the world, but that doesn't tell us why it's more important to change the world today than it was back then. Then the Rebbe continues, and what it says later in Kinus Hashluchim, that in the Deirish Hashanim, in the early generations, they were able to refine things quickly. It also says there through davening, Krishma and Psuka de Zimra, but it doesn't mention tefillah, davening, that dafka tefillah changes reality and heals the sick and other physical things that tefillah does. Mitzvahs. So we have here a question. Now, the Kerega maybe answers part of the question. Why? Because you could say that then they were able to achieve it with a short, quick prayer. Was able to achieve what they had to achieve. But the Rebbe makes it very clear that doesn't mean they achieved change of the world. So the question remains, what makes Zman Hazeh more prayer-prone and oriented, that the refinement comes through prayer than Torah? So the Rebbe says, Ulai, Gam Kan HaPirish Kain, the Loi Kerega. We could say here also in Kinus Hashluchim, the Pirish is also this way. The Loi Kerega, it's not like a moment, it's a lengthier thing. But what does that mean? Because when you look in Pri Eitz Chaim, it says that before the temple was destroyed, Zun, Zoir, Zoh, and Nukve were ponim b'ponim. They faced each other. And V'loi hoyu tzrichim el tfiloseinu, they didn't need our prayer. Because moichin, there was always a connection, a divine connection between the higher levels and the lower levels. So according to this, the Rebbe says, the more the histalkus, the more there's a dissonance, a separation between so-called the divine, moichin and midis, or zun and so on, which is bizman hazeh, the more you need prayer. So the Rebbe's answer is essentially this. He's adding a tremendous component that you can't necessarily see directly in Kinus Hashluchim. Only after you hear the Rebbe's answer, then you see it. That the Alter Rebbe's answer is the following. First, we have to establish that prayer does something that Torah does, which is changes the world. They didn't need that because the world was already more aligned with the divine back then. So they didn't need the prayer to do so. Bizman hazeh, because they're not aligned, that's why you need prayer, because prayer does make that change, and Torah can't achieve that. In those days, Torah and mitzvahs was enough, and Krishma and Psuka de Zimra did the little minimum that quickly does a refinement, whatever refinement is necessary. But if you want a full refinement of a world that's not aligned with the divine as it is in our day, prayer is the way to go, because prayer affects and changes the reality of existence. Then the Rebbe cites a Geras HaKedesh, Seif Perek Hey and Seif Perek Tes, end of chapter 5 and 9. That charity compared to Torah, also that charity, tzedakah today, is more primary than it was then, and greater than Torah in a way. The Rebbe says you can apply the same ideas over to here. And the Rebbe says, but then we still have a remaining question. And that question is, isn't tefillah a mitzvah sesame Torah also in the Deresh Hashem? When the mitzvah sesame of tefillah is that when there's a need, you pray. So if somebody was sick then, you also needed to pray. So the Rebbe says that's not a question because that's a separate inyan. Obviously you need to pray. Because here we're talking about the birur of the netzutzis elevating the sparks as the soul comes down to a lower level. So it's true, always tefillah is a prayer to achieve change. But the importance of achieving change in a world that does not have the divine connection as much is the key difference between now and back then. Yes, okay. And the Rebbe has more footnotes on this. So this basically comes down to this, that prayer has a force that you don't find earlier. And this explains perhaps why today saying Tehillim became such a major thing. The Frierdiker Rebbe made a big thing. He did not have that type of emphasis in the past because we're living in a world that's darker and more crass and coarse. So we need to have more power to create change within existence. Torah mitzvahs has its role, as he continues to explain in Kinus Hashluchim there. But tefillah has that tremendous component to actually create that physical change that ultimately refines an edel zeis and the world that which we live. Now, as far as why people don't put that much emphasis on prayer today as it should, well, that's what the Alter Rebbe bemoans in the other Kinus Hashluchim, that they were rushing, they were taking a chazan who they didn't want him to give him to daven adama because he was davening too slowly, and one person wanted to go to work. You should see the Alter Rebbe's words there. So even though today we do have a shlichus that the Rebbe gave us in helping other Jews and so on, but the power of prayer that the Alter Rebbe writes did not change. The Priyetz Chaim still applies. Each one of us, l'fum shura delay, has to do what we can in this element of prayer. So I have no excuses for why people don't daven. I go back always to the same statement. It's a lost art. Maybe lost is not a good word. It's an art that has to be yet rediscovered and revisited, and it can help us all because it actually does that type of refinement that we just discussed. With that said, let us go to the 3 essays. So first essay is Bricks and Stones, The Power of Return by Shimon Gopin. 43 years old, Yeshivas Lud Kfar Chabad in Israel. So this is a Hebrew essay. Okay. And a very creative type of essay. He discusses contrasting narratives of a person who grew up with Yiddishkeit and a person who became a Baal Tshuva, and how somebody was mocking him. And talking about the importance and power of Tshuva and how we should look at that. And obviously the inappropriateness of mocking or in any way laughing at somebody that is not, who may not be able to daven as well as another person because they didn't grow up in it. So in this essay, he basically takes the whole difference in the Sikha of the Rebbe, Shmois Chelik Vov, Levanim and Avonim, that there's Levanim are bricks made by people and Avonim are stones made by God, which means stones of earth, and Levanim is made from different materials that create a mortar. So he explains that the difference is, one is obviously the deeper Dirib Tachtenim comes in refining things that come from the bottom up, as opposed to things that are already Avonim stones, like the Beis HaMikdash of stone. And he applies that to this topic of how we treat different people who come from born a certain way into the frum world, and others that had to work hard at it, and appreciating both an Elam Shana Nefesh, which is time, space, and the human being, this dimension and the depth of actually something that comes through from the bottom up as opposed from the top down. The power of tshuva and return. Okay, that's essay number 1, and this and the other essays can be received by anybody if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter at meaningfullife.com, or you can see them at meaningfullife.com/mylife/essays-2016. The essays of 2015 is -2015. Okay, the next essay is Outside the Box by Chaya Shuchat, 43, Brooklyn, New York. Okay, very well written, and though I was not a judge, I definitely look at this essay as a top essay. Talking about hearing constantly about thinking outside the box, and the balance of two things, that the Baal Shem Tov on one hand was very much out of the box and taught us how we should not live a dreary, guilt-inducing burden. There should be simcha. Yet following the Chassidic movement, we also know that Chassidim are among the most meticulous in observing the finer points of halacha, how do we resolve this apparent contradiction, the in-box and out-of-box contradiction? So in a very creative way, uses the Orden, Makam Orden Eina Min Amida, that it's occupies space, it's a box, but it's outside the box at the same time, and applies that to our Veda using Binyamin Kletzker as an example, where he wrote Ein Eid Malvade when he was making his calculations and accounting at that bottom line. But on every line he wrote the calculations, so he was both a businessman, but he understood that the paradox that while you're within, you have to always remain above. The fusion of opposites, Nesa Havchin Nimnam Nimnois, which is with the power of Teda. She also uses the leap year, which was last year a leap year, that also is the in-box, outside the box, because you can say that the moon, that the sun is more like an inside-the-box consistent. The moon is the waxes and wanes, it's more like the out-of-the-box, and you need to join the two. So very well done essay that concludes with practical tips. Practical tips, embracing opposites, finite giving with infinite love, big ideas, small steps, work and play. Highly recommended to read, really I found it very insightful and practical, and actually with tremendous lessons for all of us. The final third essay is Getting to Know the Real You by Menachem Mendel Marinovsky, age 21. Shliach in Yeshiva of Manchester, and originates from Houston, Texas. So his essay, he opens up with quoting from the Maimer Vata Tetzava Mem Aleph about that the Amunah that's within each one of us can be makivdik, and you need a Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu, to bring it out b'primius. Number 2, a quote from Teira that you don't need something new because it's already in there, so it's easier to bring out that faith within us. And finally, from Tanya Perek Chav Ches, the quote that it's not one soul within us that sometimes wants to daven, sometimes wants the opposite. It's two souls, and that helps us tremendously be able to conquer the animal soul. And so then he goes into who is the real me, and using these principles in Tanya Chassidus, and the Maimorim goes through this discussion, who's the real me, and again, very well done, and brings it down in practical terms of how to bring down abstract belief into conscious awareness. And of course, Moshe Rabbeinu helps us do that, and the Moshe Shebachol Dar, and he discusses also in a very personal way. So in conclusion, he says, if you lack self-awareness, if you're not sure where you're holding in both your religious and moral status, therefore not sure as who you are, you must recognize that you're a Jew. And goes into practical application of helping that connection, well-sourced as well, a bibliography with sources. Again, a very well-done essay, which I commend him for. And with that, we conclude the 3 essays. And we also conclude, this has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 140. And every week, Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m., it's an honor to be hosting this, and it's an honor to receive and continue to receive your comments, your questions, your rebuttals, and please keep them coming anonymously, easily to submit at meaningfullife.com/mylife, and you can submit any question you wish. Nothing is off limits. As well, we're also going to, by Tes Kislev time, we're going to sum up the question I asked in the last few weeks, which is, what are the 3 greatest challenges facing our community? And we have quite a few responses, and it's interesting to see, once we'll tally them all up, what people saw and what the consensus is, which then, of course, is a stepping stone to beginning to address some of these issues. We've addressed some others, and taking, of course, the Rebbe's answers, the Rebbe's directives from Chassidus in general, applying it to our personal lives. So this has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 140. Everyone have a very Chassidish week, a Chassidish Chedesh, a Chedesh HaGeula should lead us to the Geula Amitis V'Ashlema, even before the Chag HaGeula of Tes Kislev and the Chag HaGeula of Yud Kislev. Be well, and thank you.